All right. I'm sorry that for those of you expecting Mike, he's not here. He sends his regards. The good thing is Mike is pretty busy right now, and he wasn't able to make it. He was able to go speak on this topic at Sapphire, but I'll give you a little overview. Mike was the project sponsor and one of the chief architects on what he wanted to do on the shop floor. His personality coming from New York and just his demeanor is quite demanding. He knows exactly what he wants, doesn't mix words. When you do a great job, you know it, and when you don't, you absolutely know that as well. If you had the chance to meet him, if we ever do another presentation again, I would encourage you to do that because he's just a guy that gets stuff done. He knows the manufacturing processes, he knows the shop floor, and being able to even have a chance to work with somebody like that was quite impressive for our team, and we'll share a little bit about what we did. My role within Dell is I'm the global shop floor practice lead, so that means any ME, MII, shop floor related project, that's me. The piece that I'll go into, and I will do my best to cover some of the background in regards to Sulzer, is what they do. By default, they're a global industry leader. A lot of different solutions, founded in 1834, and they've grown over the years into different markets, oil and gas, power, water, transportation, 170 different locations. With their background, they're very diverse from what they do, and some of the slides I'll show you after this, you'll see some of their end products. And the divisions from what they have, they make pumps, 20 different plants, sites that they have, 120 different service centers. They have a division business that's Chemtech that's focused on separating, mixing, and reacting technologies. They have turbine systems. So from that, they're repairing, replacing oil and gas turbines. But the division that we were dealing with wasn't everybody. It was one plant starting in New York. And in that one division, they heard about MII before, but it was in Switzerland at one of their other plants. And they heard about some things that they wanted to do, but at this facility, they did something different. This facility, they're dealing with surface solutions. They have their products and services, their coating solutions, the equipment, materials, and services that go with that. So some of the materials that are up here, they'll have a coating on them. And it's not just like getting, a spray paint can and spraying on top of it and saying, okay, you got Rust-Oleum and different types. You have high-end surface coatings that you need for turbines, aircrafts, anti-corrosion. And how you apply that material is unique, and you need a special adhesive on how you do it in the process. They make those machines. And at this facility, they're not only machining the parts, but then they're doing the assembly. Some of the things that they do, it's thermal spray, physical vapor deposition, plasma heat transfer. At this facility in Westbury, New York, they do a couple different things. They have the computer programming software that will go into the machines as they assemble it. They have lathing machines that are actually making milling and lathing at the end parts that they're using to construct these. So at the end of a spray nozzle that's coming out, they're machining that component, putting it back, and they're cranking it out of a MES machine. It's coming back, and then eventually it will go into the assembly part of the plant. And they also do the electrical mechanical assembly and the quality inspection test. So they can take the raw material that's coming in, get the components as it goes through. They're machining part of it. They're not just assembling it. And then go from that machine piece where they need to actually track how many parts per unit that are coming out, and then they'll go over to the assembly where you have physical workers, no machine interface. The piece with the project that they wanted to do, they already had SAP at the back end. They had shop floor personnel of 20 plus years of experience. They're working 3+ shifts. And what they wanted to do was try to streamline some of the transactions that they're doing. So they'll have a production order that gets released. It will come down. They'll start some of the paperwork that will also be printed out. They might be, if it's a machine work center, meaning they're tracking the units, they had a component where you had the paper. They're going into the Greco system that would be the machine control, getting the drawings, loading it up. And at the same time, they're going over to SAP to record the transactions. And by default, some of the transactions, if you've ever dealt with those before, shop floor confirmations, they're not going through. And then your inventory's off, causes a lot of problems. Or some of the quality components, it was outside the process, it was manual. It was done on pieces of paper that went through, not in SAP QM, and they wanted to try to streamline that. They had an Excel sheet that went along with the pack that goes on the floor to say this is what you're going to go make, and it would travel to the different units. So what they wanted to do was try to take that data for what they wanted, primarily focused on the operator, and streamline it. Make it easier for the guy to do his job. But they also wanted to read off the machines. So the piece from MII, originally when we came in, is trying to say, what's that vision? Working with Mike and Rob and some of the other teams, they were very busy with what they were doing. They're running 3 turns. Everybody's pretty crazy with what their work is, and they wanted to try to streamline a lot of the functionality they were doing because they were not only spending time manufacturing, but they were spending a lot of time that was wasted doing the corrections, cleaning up the back-end system, and specifically at month end, trying to make sure the inventory is balanced and you don't have errors and discrepancies, and then people were spending a lot of more time trying to figure out why you had a variance when it was really just an incorrect transaction. Our team came in, worked with the Sulzer team, and we did a roadmap initially, just trying to come up. It's just part of the proposal process, trying to help them figure out how they wanted to do it and say, we're not going to bite off everything. We did that. We came back and we started deploying that piece of functionality. From the Dell side, depending on the week, you might have up to 4 different people going back and forth. And the scope was not just transactions back to SAP, but it was also transactions back to the shop floor where we're pulling up machine data, tags from a historian that's part of Greco. Sulzer, you could say you had 2 functional, but you also had more than that. You had a plant supervisor that was, he really didn't take no as an acceptable answer. He saw his operators, he trusted them, you could tell he loved his job, he covered it, and he wanted to make sure that if he's focused on this, he wants to make sure it's easier. He doesn't want more work for him. So the team, depending on it, it says 2, but we had more depending on the time frame. And at one point in the project, I think, because they were so busy, we actually, Mike was kind enough, we told him our concerns, and he sequestered them in a hotel for a week so we could go do the testing and get their feedback on some of the designs because we wanted to make sure it matched how they did their processes. The scope, standard deployment, designing the functional specs, coding, testing, training, they had a lot of unique processes. I would probably articulate that not all operator dashboards, that main interface, are all the same. And Sulzer was no exception. They had some unique things that they wanted to do, checks and balances. They weren't in SAP to make sure somebody did adherence to how they're going to manufacture something, but they wanted it in MII. Those roles we put in, but it took a little bit to understand what those rules were. For us, from a regular project standpoint, we managed everything on SharePoint. We did a lot more remote. We cut down on cost. And the big thing was getting the buy-in from their users. We put them in front of the tool and making sure that it was meeting their requirements. I'm going to go over a couple of slides to views of what the screens are. First thing that we did, and we just did the original login. It's always one of the first specs you do in any MII project. How are the users going to get in? Not just your regular login that you get in ECC, but when you're looking at a shop floor user, they usually have a badge system. They could have an employee ID. They could just type in their username, Windows password. Those are things that you have to go think about. For these guys, they wanted to default it per work center because they could have floaters. At one day, you're working 1 machine, but by the way, you're not just working 1, you're working 2. And you're over there, you're working 3. We needed that flexibility based on work center to be able to see what people are doing, keep multiple screens open. But we also wanted to track who did what, because they want to know from a traceability perspective, if there is a quality issue, they want to know who did it, so we could record that in the database. So for them, they did a work center, and then we had an employee lookup table that we could hit back to a separate database that they had for all their badges, and they would type it in. The main screen, touch screen, the piece that we tried to design was give them everything that they want today. Now, if you look at it, what they had before, they had a printed off copy of production order that would come through. This is what I had to do. They had an Excel schedule based on the sequence, which could get updated pretty regularly. They would try not to have, they'd try to have it set within, a 24-hour period, but that'd be dependent on really what was going on that day and what was the hot item. The piece for them, though, when they came across, they wanted to be able to consolidate a lot of those views, and that's what we did in the screen. Looking at, the dashboard, coming back, confirmation history, I could see what I did before. I could do a piece called a pick list where I'm getting parts, an IPI sheet. I think I have one of the screens after this, in-process inspection. So they didn't have SAP QM, but we created something in here to mimic some of the rules that they were currently doing in Excel that then they would consolidate after they got the paper back. They had a link to documents and drawings, so some certain assembly features, and this was for the machine workstations and the assembly, certain assembly features they need to make sure how it was going to go together. We linked back to their document repository to bring those things up. On the piece here, I could see at the top, I could see all the orders in sequence, and it was sorted by the status and what selected order, and particularly what work center, so it defaults in. So depending on what you're working on, I know what my queue is, and I could see the current status. And then I'm tracking the different times. Previous, you didn't get that. You didn't get it real time. You get it after that packet went to the end of the line and you knew you produced it and somebody keyed it back into the system. Or potentially you get it when the person put in the confirmation after they finished what they were doing if they didn't have an error. So we made it real time. When I go to confirmation history, they wanted to see what they did before. Previous, it was in dealing with SAP transaction. They would log in, say what they did, it would go back up. If there was an error, somebody settled it in the back office. If I went from a pick list, I need to go get parts, partial pick. They tried to simplify that transaction also. So you could see the method to the madness in here is you're trying to put a lot of the things that the person would be jumping through different transactions, they're always going back to the same view. Trying to expedite that process, have that person spend less time dealing with the screens and more time actually producing material and focusing on what was more important. Downtime for them was a pretty big item. Standardized the downtime codes. Prior, you had the versions that would pop up. If somebody writes a downtime code, they put it on a piece of paper. But they didn't have that in SAP, so we built that up. Here's your codes, and we did it by level. Best practice is usually at least 2 levels. For these gentlemen, they did it that way, but then they could tie it back to the order, so now they have real-time traceability of why they had issues for those particular work centers that are machines. Goods receipt. Standard transaction, we just tried to condense it so the person's not jumping in between different SAP screens. Standard rules that you would do today in standard ECC, we just simplified the screen and made it easier so they're not looking at everything else that they wanted to. And then for documents, this is just one example. I could see the different ones up, double click on it, bring it back up. So for an operator focus, their point of view on the world is one view, the operator dashboard. The only other thing they're doing is the Greco piece that was actually controlling the machines with actual drawings to say, okay, if I need to CNC this, this is my drawing, and they're loading that program. For them, you keep it simple. But the Greco in behind, I can get the alerts. So if there was a downtime alert, like in the previous screen, and the machine told me that, not manually intervened, I could read that from the Greco system. I would interface. So then I have that machine connectivity layer that I didn't have before that would usually sit there, and I couldn't boil that back up. And yes, they were big on OEE. They had their versions, they had their piece, they liked the dashboards, but they had the detail to go come back and see how we were doing. The pieces for them is trying to be able to consolidate it. They spent a lot of time cleaning up data, being able to report off of it, but not being able to take proactive measurements. Now, if I simplify the transactions and get it real time, it makes the person's job a little bit easier, that the supervisor is not running around trying to collect the data to figure out what he has to do. He's then acting on it. I know I went quickly through that, and I'm trying to save some time for questions. And some of the benefits that we got, Rob was the daily project manager. So he was your main interface compared to the Dell project manager at the time. And they would tie back and forth. And Mike, he was a project sponsor. Rob initially on the project was probably pretty busy. Didn't have a lot of time to focus on it. And that's mainly because he's running operations. If the company's not producing material and running the plant, by default, nobody should be there, which is understandable. To get Rob to be able to say something like that is just a nice win, because he's a tough customer. He's very busy to get his focus, and he owned it at the end of the day. He learned a lot along the way about what people did. He got cross-trained in the different areas when we brought up QM. and it was separate just to be able to track the quality and inspection and bring that up without SAP QM, just within MII, a very light version, he understood that process. So to be able to get him to say something positive is definitely a very nice thing. The information on demand, they had the access databases, they would extract it out, they did the reporting externally, and now it's real time. They see it. It's one interface to the users, that's what they see. That's the operator's view. And I can create extra rules to make sure that I'd have to customize an SAP to try to make it easy for the operator so they don't make mistakes. And I spend less time every month correcting things that somebody might have done in error. The one thing that did pop up was faster. They're spending less time at the terminals, they're not worrying about data, they could produce more. After the time period, that's what they got. And they're very happy about it. There was one example that did pop up with faster deliveries and things, they're not dealing with it. When I spoke with Mike at Sapphire, he told me that the week before Sapphire when we spoke, he said one of the things that we put in, disaster recovery, well, what happens when SAP goes down? And I'm tying to it. He said it worked perfectly. The shop floor maintained their uptime. They had their screens to go function. They kept on producing, came back on in 2 hours. They had the buffer, went through, they processed it, corrected any errors. Shop floor kept on producing. He didn't stop production. So those are the things with the visibility they didn't have before previously if they had an SAP problem. You're not using that transaction, and then you went back to paper. Once I go back to paper, then I have the component of somebody has to go key that back in, which would then go to the lucky supervisor on that shift that would then have to go key those in while he's doing his other job addressing production issues. There are a couple things from learning points. Not every project goes smoothly. This one will be none different. Probably the biggest thing with the project itself was the machine integration. The piece that we tied back to from the control system, Greco, great company, covered some stuff. They had the architecture, they had it before, they were upgrading it, but they were putting in that layer. In order to put in that layer of connectivity, they had to not only put in the hardware, but they were also putting in the components to be able to tie back to the tags of the respective machines. And if you're familiar with that shop floor integration, that landscape can be somewhat difficult because it's sporadic. Not every machine connects. Even if you have the same type of machine, it could be a different version of the software, you don't always have the same data points. Well, the piece of connecting to the machines wasn't it, but there were just some issues trying to be able to align the process. We had our development when we're going through, all the operator screens, the downtime, the components, but when we wanted to go connect to the machine, they had that as a separate spec, they're behind. Resources weren't available. They just had different priorities. They did follow through, they came back, got them back up and running, but what we had to do is decouple the design at a point and make a design point that said, we're going to assume that they're going to give us this data. We're going to assume that we're going to get these feeds back and then deploy it, go live, without that initial take. For us, a little bit of a risk, but it went smoothly. They then went live with us, then they came back and they got the rest of the machine integration in, where you had the connectivity points. So we originally had a, big bang for the plant, but then it switched out based on the timing. And from a Mike's perspective, he was very admirable. He was appreciative that we could cover that level of flexibility, and we stayed on top of it. I mentioned the disaster recovery, and that was somewhat of a learning curve for us on one side. We always include it. We always try to determine what's your buffer. How many transactions do you need to keep in the queue? What happens if MII goes? What happens if SAP goes down? What happens if that other system doesn't connect? What functions do I need to keep up and running? And there was a point of over-engineering it to a point of what's the bare minimum that you need. For us, they had some unique requirements that were a little bit more than just the normal 8-hour buffer of production orders and queuing it up. They also wanted to make sure that I can go correct it because they didn't like certain transactions that they had in SAP. For us, the learning curve, admit that you're wrong and come back and fix it. For him, Mike, that was one of his sticking points. The best thing was when he came back and said it worked flawlessly and we're good to go, and it was a non-event. The resource availability I did mention, When you're running 3 turns and the guys are that busy on the floor and they know the business, they've been there 20 plus years. They know every inch of the plant, it's stacked side by side, and you want to get the plant supervisor, a genuinely nice guy. He just can't talk to you. But you need him to approve the design because you can't kick it out, or you need him to test it based on the transactions because you don't understand the business rules, or you think you do, but you want to validate it prior to putting it into operations and you make an error. That was difficult. It's not that they didn't want to help. They were just busy. The good part was we eventually got them to block off time. We started raising the flag. We can't meet our date. They're not available. They'd not given enough detail. The lesson for us wasn't so much, blocking off the resources, but trying to set that expectation early. Because you are designing a system that are business rules that are unique. I could give you an operator dashboard from any one of our clients and show it to you, and it will look kind of the same, different layout, different schema. Key thing is it's going to be a lot different in the business rules from a company that's manufacturing how they choose to manufacture compared to somebody in a similar industry. They have their own rules, own business rules that you have to incorporate into design. For us, we should have probably told them more up front. Even if we did, I'm not sure if it would have made a difference because they were still busy. But at the end of the day, we did sequester them, get them into the room. And the good part is they went live. They covered it. They're happy with the system. They're looking to, expansions, and they're showing it off, which is nice. Those are the general overview, and I did try to keep it brief. I'm open to any questions that you guys have. I'd be more than welcome to, entertain any of them. Yes, sir.
About the MII up to ECC, did you just use standard out-of-the-box MII stuff, or did you have to write anything, asynchronous versus synchronous for confirmations and whatnot?
For this one, we just used out-of-the-box for what we had, the standard calls, used the iDocs that went down. There were a couple maintenance screens that we had to go create, so if a transaction was in queue, so that somebody did a confirmation and that there was a correction that needed to be done. And they knew it was wrong, and it already went up. They could resend that and correct it. Say that it should have been confirmed of 10, quantity of 10, when it was really 8. The supervisor could go into that maintenance screen and then edit it behind the scenes, but the operator wouldn't have visibility to that. So the supervisor would have a way to quickly edit something that might take a reversal. It would take a reversal out of SAP and then put it back up. We streamlined it in those interfaces to make it easy for the supervisor to do the job. Because somebody makes a submission, we didn't want the operator to go correct it. We left it to a supervisor role. So we gave more edit authority, but we didn't say you had to go cancel it and then bring it back. But they were standard calls. They didn't customize those transactions in SAP. Yes, sir.
For your PLC interfaces, it looked like you were doing downtime through the PLC. Were you doing transactional data through the PLCs as well? And if so, what happened when you had a PLC go down, when you have machine interface stop?
From the connectivity to the machine, typically it was downtime for the alerts. We did have some quantities. If it did go down, they would have to manually put it in. So the way that we designed it was, by default, you always have to key it manually if you had to as a backup. The other piece with downtime that I've learned over the years is if the machine's not reporting it at that moment, you can't always expect the operator to do it. I had a customer a while ago that pops in. Their first priority is to fix the problem, not come back and report the issue. So what we did in the downtime was we made it retroactive. So as I go through, it breaks right now. I can come back afterwards and say that, look, it broke 5 minutes from now, and I'm able to go correct it. You would like it to be instantaneous. You want the operator to stop for the real-time information, but it's a choice. What's more important? If you have a manufacturing facility, I had another customer tell me this, they're baking cakes. Fix all the pile of broken cakes that are falling off the line that are stacking up. And he told me this happened. Or go over and say that you have a problem. Well, the first reaction was fix the problem, then go back and retro report it. Yes, sir.
I saw on the work list on the dashboard, did Sulzer develop any prioritization? I know MII doesn't do scheduling, but did they build logic based off of frozen dates or anything like that?
Let me go back to the screen. We got the released orders coming down, and I believe we had one release screen that was on there that they could release on top of it. They had to prioritize. So you have the SAP production order release that they would trigger standard, then I would get it, and then they could release it off that again. So you had a separate view for the supervisor that they could create their own release when I want to put it to the floor. So they had an additional flag on top of what SAP gave it. We're kind of used to doing that at different clients because they like the SAP release. The traditional rule is when I release an SAP production order, it goes to the shop floor. Once I give it to the shop floor, I can incur cost. But then you have a buffer in between that some people want, and they did that for them, that we just did in MII. I guess silence is golden. Nobody else has any questions. Thank you very much for your time. I apologize that Mike wasn't here, but I thank you.